Yeah. Coming out tonight, and we'll get underway here. By the way, in case I forget it, we won't meet next Sunday night because that'll be Vacation Bible School. And then we'll, if y'all wish, we'll maybe do it a couple more Sunday nights. I still got a good bit of information we can look at, but whatever y'all want to do. But I'll conclude it certainly before school starts back and Awana starts back. And I don't want to get in the way of Vacation Bible School next week. So we'll hopefully meet again on the 29th, 2 weeks from tonight. And we'll get started. And Allie, would you lead us, please? Amen. Well, we'll want to look tonight at another clue regarding the resurrection, unique burial practice that went on there at that time. And, God, He does everything obviously perfectly. And sometimes we miss some of these things that are more subtle that we find in the Scriptures and so on. And looking at other sources of information, especially historical information and archaeological information, as we've talked about. And one of the things that enabled these events to transpire as they did was the way in which the practice that went on in their burial. And this method of burial was only existed in a very small part of the world, mainly in Israel, for probably not 100 years. And that was the burial in stone-hewn tombs, and then the bones being placed in ossuaries after the flesh had decomposed. And so that's what we'll look at here to begin with tonight. And so I did a study here at some point on what I call the limestone age. Because in that part of the world, limestone is everywhere. It's prevalent. That's mostly what they have. Limestone is not as hard as the granite we have here, but it's plenty hard enough. It's more porous and so on, and they do everything with limestone. And so where the tomb of Jesus was an abandoned limestone quarry. It had been a quarry for probably hundreds of years, and they had stopped using it probably 300 or 400 years, I'm trying to say, before Jesus came on the scene. And if you go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the place that they tell us, and I'm convinced is Calvary, where the cross was, is not a very high place, maybe as high as this ceiling or so. And it was an outcropping in this limestone quarry where, as they began to carve out the big blocks of limestone, it cracked. And so they abandoned it and they left it there. And it was perfect for jamming the upright beams of the cross in these crevices. And they have that there today, and it's you can see it. And I was surprised when I saw that, and it wasn't any higher than it was, because we've sung songs about Mount Calvary and so on. But it made sense because they put a sign over his cross. If it had been very high, you couldn't have read it as you passed by. There's a major road there that went by there, and they could walk by or ride by and look up and see and read that sign. So he wasn't very high. Also, the body was not very high off the ground. The cross, you'll see it depicted in different ways, and there were different styles, but the cross was not very high because it was a lot of work to put a body up on the cross and hang it up there and then take it down again if they decided to do that. So therefore, this limestone is such a key part of the building that goes on there, the burial practices, especially at that time, and so forth. But the way that this, known as this era of stone, only lasted for from about 20 BC to 70 AD. Now it came about in 20 BC around that time because of Herod the Great's building projects. And Herod the Great was one of the great builders in the history of that part of the world. And most of what he had anything to do with building, at least part of it, is still there today. Particularly the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. That was all work done in his time. And so there was a tremendous increase in stone workers around Jerusalem in particular, because it became a part of not only burial practices and building projects, but their religious practices. Because the limestone and vessels carved out of limestone were considered to be pure. Pottery was not, because it was mixed up and made with men and women's hands and so forth. So they would make this stuff out of limestone. It became a huge industry, and they continue to find evidence of it today. So stone became the answer. The purity laws grew in importance, and rabbinic opinion strengthened this practice. The rabbinic meaning the rabbis, their religious leaders who made the rules and so forth and interpreted the scriptures, said that the limestone could be used for purification purposes, pottery and so on could not be. So therefore, when Jesus, in his first miracle at the wedding in Cana, if you go back and read that, it tells us that these vessels that he had them to fill with water were pure. They were stone water pots for Jewish purification, according to John. Each contained 20 to 30 gallons. He told them to fill them with water, and then he told them to dip it out and serve it, and that water became wine. Now we get into there all the symbolism, the wine being symbolic of his blood, the purity of the pots and the water becoming his blood for our sanctification and so forth. So these were the kind of pots that would have been used there, and they would have been something like this. These are ancient limestone pots. They're carved directly out of the limestone. And so they, as it says here, that's probably the type used in the Cana wedding, considered pure, and so on. And so this is an example of where they found this 2,000-year-old stoneware factory. And you can see that they were starting to shape the limestone. And as we see there, so they're drinking vessels for special religious purposes were carved directly out of a solid piece of limestone. And so, you know, you've always heard the story, the legend of the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail being the cup supposedly that Jesus drank from on the night of the Last Supper with his disciples and so forth. And so people assume when they paint pictures of it or make movies about it that it's some elaborate container. It would have been something like that, a cheap, looking to us, not cheap, but looking to us, cheap, a limestone cup. So that was probably what he drank out of, because it would have been considered pure, and that's what they would have done. So this limestone and the use of it was an extremely important part of everything that they did. So it became an extremely important part, as I said, of their burial practices. And not only did they carve these tombs out of the old limestone, especially a quarry where they'd cut into the ground and you'd have the straight wall or bank there. And it was relatively easy to carve in that stone. But once it was carved, it was like any other stone. It was not going to move. It was going to stay there. Now, they also then began to produce the ossuaries. And this is an ossuary that was discovered some years ago. And on the side of it, of course, in Hebrew, it says James. And by the way, James is not a Jewish name. It's an English name. It was Yakabah. In Hebrew, there is no J. Anything that's a J to us, to them is a Y. So Jacobah was Jacob, which was later changed to James. And I won't get into that in the King James process and so on. But it says on the ossuary, when translated into English, James, son of Joseph and brother of Jesus. And so there's been a lot of debate over the years about that, exactly what that means. But there's been an awful lot of study, and most agree that this was the brother, half-brother of Jesus. And so this is an ossuary. And as it says there, it only lasted 100 years or less, this practice. So they would take the bones, after the body decomposed for about a year or so, they would go and take the bones, clean them, and then they'd put them in this limestone box. And then they'd put it on a shelf somewhere. And they would leave it there indefinitely. And they still find them. They find them all over the place in Israel. Found Caiaphas, and I have a picture of it there. By the way, to deviate just a little bit, one of the greatest Israeli statisticians and one of the greatest in the world who died last year did calculations on the likelihood of there being a James with a daddy named Joseph and a brother named Jesus in that part of the world at that time. And he decided that the likelihood was that in all of that area there was one, maybe two. He said it was really came down to statistically to 1.7 people, so it was one person. So anyway, I don't have any doubt that was James Ossuary, and no reason to doubt that, just those people who don't want to face who Jesus was. And the reason it would be carved on there was because that was an extremely important person, an extremely famous person, Jesus, his brother. And everybody knew who they were and who Joseph was and so on. Well, this is the one of Caiaphas. You can see it's a lot fancier. Caiaphas was the high priest who was involved in sentencing Jesus and getting him sentenced to death by crucifixion and so forth. Excuse me. Some years ago, they found his ossuary, and his bones were still in it. Now, they couldn't do DNA tests on those bones. They were 2,000 years old, but they did an awful lot of testing, and they were able to determine that it was a male, that he was probably, when he died, about 60 years old, that he was from that part of the world, that he was well-to-do, and so on. So there's no doubt, I think in a reasonable person's mind, it was the ossuary of Caiaphas. And so you see how, and it's, by the way, on the end there, if you can make it out, it's carved Joseph Caiaphas. Joseph Caiaphas. And so that's limestone, of course. And I think I mentioned one time, if you go back and study this, in the tomb there where they found this ossuary, they found numerous others, and they were able to identify some of those as the relatives of Joseph Caiaphas. And they found the crucifixion nails. Fascinating thing. And this, so they would hew out the tombs out of the rock. And we know that Joseph, this is Joseph of Arimathea, that he had a very elaborate one. It was new. It had never been used before. No bodies had ever been in it. It would have been real elaborate. It would have been really nice because he was a very wealthy, powerful man, as we talked about, when we talked about the fact they could not have misidentified where this grave was. And so that was a common practice, but only for a relatively short time. There's a photograph of one that has a rolling stone. As I talked about last week, I think, that they've only found 4 in all of Israel that had the rolling stones. And they were very elaborate tombs of very wealthy people. The other 98% or whatever were just big blocks or big stones that they would roll in there. So, cut in stone, and I won't get into that anymore, but Joseph, it talks about him and his tomb, having been cut in a stone, had never been used. Nobody had ever been put in it before. And so what's the significance of that? Well, among other things, in most cases, people who were executed by the Romans or executed by the Jews, who did it by stoning and not crucifixion, their bodies were just thrown away many times. Most of the time, they were just thrown away. If it hadn't been a holiday, they would have left these men's bodies on the cross and let them decompose, let the birds eat them, whatever, because they wanted to terrorize people. That's what it was about, so that people would comply. And so the most common burial practice for the Romans, for the Greeks, was cremation. They burned the bodies like so many cultures in the world did and do. In India, for instance, that's about the only way they do it. Of course, burial in the ground, which is our main practice, and sometimes just discarding them. So, therefore, the fact that this practice had come about, and they placed him in a rock-hewn tomb that they could have access to, and then they later on probably did plan to put his bones in an ossuary. As a result, it shaped up, everything shaped up where they knew where the body was. It was going to be preserved. They could go and view it. They could determine, as we talked about at length, that it was the body of Jesus of Nazareth, and so on. So that practice became very significant, very important in the story of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. Now here's an example of, for a long time, there was very little evidence, physical evidence, archaeological evidence of crucifixion. And some years ago, they discovered this heel bone with this crucifixion nail still in it, 2,000 years old. It's a horrible looking thing, isn't it? If you've ever banged your heel real good on something, that's painful. We can't imagine having a big spike like that driven through your heel. And what they would do was, and we don't know if they did that in Jesus' case because it's not that clear on the shroud, but in addition to driving these big spikes through the wrist, the carpal tunnel, I should say, of the wrist, they would put their feet on either side of the upright post and drive those spikes through their ankles or through their heels. In this case, they know the name of this man. His name was Johanna, something like that. He was a real young man, and he had been crucified, and they found these bones in an ossuary. So here we have archaeological evidence that many people who had been crucified by the Romans indeed were buried, and their bodies later placed in ossuaries. Most people said, that would never happen. They would have thrown them away and let the animals eat them or whatever. So there we have that evidence so that tells us that was what they had planned to do with the remains of Jesus. They thought his body would decompose. They didn't understand the scriptures as it tells us because the Bible said it never would, and because he was sinless. But they thought his body would decompose and they would wind up later going back, getting his bones, putting them in an ossuary. Of course, it wasn't necessary because he was resurrected on the third day. So that practice became extremely important, provided more clear proof that he was not there, but he was risen, as the angels declared. And by the way, whoever did that painting there, that is really close to probably how it looked, because where the tomb was and where the edicule is today in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Calvary, you see how low it is there. It's just a rock outcropping in that painting, and it's very close by. And that's what the Gospels say. There was a tomb nearby. And I recently did a devotion where they have discovered that it was a garden, which John tells us there was a garden there. And they found evidence of grapevines and olive trees and all of that all around that area. It probably was a beautiful place. Probably a very aromatic place in the springtime. And so here's another painting of Peter and John in the tomb. They've entered and discovered, and they're trying to get their head around what they're seeing here that we talked about. That was made possible by the fact that this was a tomb, a rock-hewn tomb, that they could access it. that there were sections inside of it where it was high enough for a man to stand, at least to their height at that time. The entrances were usually real low, as the Bible tells us, because they had to stoop down to look, and so on. So that burial practice is a really important part of this. And so we have that transparency. They said to the women, come and see where his body was. He's not here. He's risen. Come and we'll show you where he was, where his body was. Come look. God wants to involve us. He does involve us. He shows us. This is what I'm doing. If we'll listen, if we'll look, if we'll believe, he'll show it to us. And so, again, as Paul said, this has not been done in a corner. This is done for everybody to see who's willing to look and to see. And so, as a result, the burial shroud, which is also part of that practice, was available. It hadn't been buried in the ground and damaged. It wasn't burned up in a cremation. It wrapped the body, and the body was laid in that tomb where it was relatively cool and where his body would not decompose. And so when God raised him from the dead in power, it was imprinted on that shroud. I'm convinced, I don't have any doubt in my own mind, that's the face of Jesus. None whatsoever. And that is a photographic negative. If you studied the Shroud of Turin, that's a photographic negative which was not discovered until 1898 when the first photograph was taken. Not only, and I won't get off on this subject tonight, but not only is that a photographic negative on that shroud, but it's three-dimensional. We can't do that today. We don't have the technology today to do that. It's three-dimensional. And as a result, they've been able to determine all sorts of things about the shape of his face and on and on. Where his injuries were. I don't have any doubt in my own mind that that's him and that they were able to find it there because God laid all of this system out through mankind where they could access it and where they could find it. And he left that incredible artifact and piece of evidence for us to see. And let me move on here before I finish tonight, because I did say this morning when I set off my car alarm that we were going to talk about it affecting Roman law. And so this is, as we look at the aftermath of the resurrection, here's one of the most amazing things, the Nazareth inscription. And the debate still rages today as to whether or not it has to do with the resurrection of Jesus. The answer is, of course it does. It's just those people who don't want to believe and don't want to hear the truth that keep saying it don't. But more and more people are coming to the agreement that the Nazareth inscription came about as a result of the resurrection of Jesus. Now, from the point of view of the Romans and the Roman government, his body was stolen. Because that's the story they were paid to tell. That's the story that everybody passed on. You know, governments and governmental officials will lie. I don't want to shock you, but they will lie. And they will lie about things they don't need to lie about many times. And so that's the lie that they were perpetrating and perpetuating. And so this is on the right is a black and white photograph of that inscription. It's discovered in 1878. It's called the Nazareth inscription because it was found in Nazareth. Imagine that, his hometown. It's in Greek. It's not in Latin. It's in Greek. And they believe that this one is called a rescript because they took it from Latin and translated it into Greek, and they placed it in Nazareth, probably because there were more Greek speakers there than Latin speakers, and so on. And they believe that it was done, at least the rescript was done by Claudius, Emperor Claudius, in 41. That's probably less than 8 years after the crucifixion and the resurrection. And so this is what the relevant parts, it's fairly lengthy, says. Concerning graves and tombs, that these remain undisturbed forever. If anyone has moved with wicked intent, those who have been buried to other places, has moved sepulchre sealing stones, what do you think it's talking about? You are absolutely not to allow anyone to move those who have been entombed. But if someone does, I wish that violator to suffer capital punishment under the title of tomb breaker. Now, why in the world would the emperor of Rome, less than 8 years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, go to this kind of length and this kind of trouble to say if you enter a rock-sealed tomb, they were only in Israel. They didn't do that in Rome. They didn't do that in any other part of the Roman Empire. If you break into that tomb, remove that stone, and steal the body, we'll execute you. We ain't going to let you do that. Obviously, it's talking about the story behind the resurrection of Jesus. By the way, that is a likeness of Claudius. And I don't know about you, I don't want to be critical, but that's an ugly-looking man to me if he looked anything like that. And, of course, he was like all the emperors. He was incredibly wicked and evil, vicious, cruel, on and on. But that's attributed to him, about 41, which is the first year of his reign, by the way. So it may have been done by somebody before him. So here's what Clyde Billington says about that. He says the Nazareth inscription fits very well within a Jewish family tomb context, but it does not fit at all within a Gentile, Greek, or Roman context. This is a man who has a PhD in archaeology and history and so forth, and he's saying it only applies to that. It could only apply to that. It couldn't apply to anything else. So he goes on to say the proper translation of that word, that's Greek, which means wicked intent, gives strong support to the conclusion that the Nazareth inscription was a rescript written in response to the story of the resurrection of Christ, which many Jews and pagan Romans believed was a fraud perpetrated by Christian Jews. So this is one of the great scholars of the world who studies those things all the time, and he's convinced that that's what it is. And I'm certainly convinced that's what it is. So here's another reason that they may have come up with this edict or this law. Because it tells us in Matthew that the graves were opened and many bodies of the saints which slept arose and came out of the graves after his resurrection. And it tells us here clearly it was after his resurrection. Because as we talked about, he was the first fruits. There could not be a resurrection until Jesus was resurrected. The scriptures are very clear on that. And so these people who came out of the tombs, they were believers in Jesus. Now, we won't get into that in detail, but they were not considered to be Old Testament saints. The Old Testament saints will not be resurrected when the church is raptured. Only the church will. I keep saying that over and over. There's so much confusion about that. The rapture only involves the church. Nobody else. No other time in history, no other people. Just the church. And so that's what had to happen before there could be a resurrection. But those people, it is believed, were resurrected. They were the first people after Jesus to be resurrected. They went with him as the first. He was the first fruits, but as his first harvest, so to speak. And when he ascended, it's believed that he took them with him to heaven. And they were the first to arrive there. Now, these people came out of the tombs. We don't know how long they'd been dead. Probably not too long, a few years at most, because they were followers of Jesus. And that's the only way they could have been saved. But, and be a part of this. But they came out of the graves. They went into the city. They walked into the city, or somehow or another they entered the city. I don't know if they walked or whether they were transported through time. I don't know how they got there, but they were resurrected, and they went into Jerusalem, and they visited with people they knew. Can you imagine that? Could you imagine somebody that you knew and loved who died some years ago appearing, visiting you? It'd be hard for us to grasp that, but what a wonderful thing it must have been. And what do you reckon they talked about? Jesus is resurrected. That's what they talked about. You know, at the transfiguration, when Jesus was transfigured before Peter, James, and John, along with Moses and Elijah, you know what they talked about? Luke tells us what they talked about. They talked about his decease at Jerusalem. That's what they were excited about. He's going to Jerusalem to die for their sins and the sins of the world. That's what they talked about. And they didn't talk about the weather. or anything else. They talked about the fact that time has finally come. Here's the Messiah. Here's the Son of God. Here's the Savior. And he's on his way to Jerusalem. Luke also said he set his face to go to Jerusalem to accomplish those things. Nothing would deter him. Nothing did deter him. He was in charge the whole time. Don't ever forget that. When he was on the cross, he was in charge. He was making decisions. He was fulfilling prophecy. He was repeating the scriptures. And he was saying, okay, now, I'm thirsty. Give me something to drink. I'm thirsty. Why? Because he was fulfilling scripture and prophecy. And then he said, now, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. I don't believe that when Jesus was on the cross, his head was hanging down. I believe he was surveying the crowds and what was going on around him. And he was loving those people. And he was knowing which ones of them were going to believe in him. And that old centurion, after he died, after Jesus dismissed his spirit, and after the earthquakes occurred, and all those events, the darkness, that old Roman centurion said, surely this is the Son of God. That old centurion, I believe, is in heaven as we speak with him. So this was what he was doing. And these people, he raised some of them just as a sample to show I have this power. And this is how it'll work. And it awaits us. It awaits us. So, let me see what time it is. I'm going to do this one right quick. This won't take but a minute. This is a Roman historian's view, talking about the aftermath. Considered to be one of the greatest historians of the world, Tacitus. And as you see, he lived from 56 to 120. His full name was Publius Cornelius Tacitus. He was a Roman orator and public official, the greatest Roman historian. He was a brilliant man. He was a pagan. He was an unbeliever. He was hateful. He was evil. But he was a great historian, and we still study his history today. And he recorded an event. And he recorded what is probably, according to Dr. Yamamuchi, he recorded what is probably the most important reference to Jesus outside the New Testament. In 115, he explicitly stated that Nero persecuted the Christians as scapegoats to avert or divert suspicion away from himself for the great fire that had devastated Rome in 64. That's when Aquila and Priscilla left, and so many Christians left Rome and began to go to different places. But this is what he said in his history. Nero fashioned the guilt and inflicted the most excellent tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. You know what he's saying? He's saying, we had this stamped out. We killed this rascal. Pontius Pilate crucified this rascal. We had this movement stamped out. And now for some reason we can't understand, there are people everywhere who have been reinvigorated. And they're going around and it's grown, it's spread, it's here in Rome, for goodness sakes. What are we going to do? You know what he's saying? The Christians had said, Jesus is resurrected. He's alive. He's the Messiah. And we'll die for him. We'll die to tell that story. And Tacitus wants them to die. He wants them to be tortured and imprisoned and killed and driven out of Rome. Because he's saying, for goodness sakes, it's a mischievous superstition, he said. He's talking about the Christian faith. So what has happened? Well, according to J.N.D. Anderson, in his book on the evidence for the resurrection in 1950, he said, it is scarcely fanciful to suggest that when he adds that a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, he's bearing indirect and unconscious testimony to the conviction of the early church that the Christ who had been crucified had risen from the grave. What would have inspired them to suddenly, when they had gone away and hidden as the disciples did, what would suddenly have inspired them to become stronger than ever? And for that to proliferate, if I can say it, across the known world so rapidly. Because they knew that he was resurrected and he was alive. And it's driving Tacitus and evil men like him crazy. Like them bombs and missiles falling on the nuclear sites in Iran is driving those evil, godless, hateful men crazy now. And they're dying in too many of them. Because God has now spoken, and he is speaking. And he's saying, here's the line. Here's how it is. You didn't believe. So, Dr. Yamamuchi says, this is an important testimony by an unsympathetic witness to the success and spread of Christianity based on a historical figure, Jesus, who was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And it's significant that Tacitus reported that an immense multitude held so strongly to their beliefs that they were willing to die rather than recant. So Tacitus, you see, the Bible says that God uses evil men to accomplish his purposes. He uses evil men all the time, unbeknownst to them. And he accomplishes his purpose through them, as well as through the righteous. The only difference is the righteous know and rewarded, and evil men are punished for their evil and their unbelief. And so there's a painting from 1876. They did everything they could to shut the Christians up. They burned them alive. They used them as torches for their games. They fed them to animals for sport. They would put them in bags with poisonous snakes, probably with spiders and things that so horrified them. They would put them in bags and throw them into the sea and drown them. And they would have big parties while they were doing it. They wouldn't recant, most of them. Some did, of course, under pressure. But most of them wouldn't. Like the great man in Revelation in the church, one of the churches, I forget which one right off, where Jesus said, my faithful martyr, Antipas. When they said to him, Antipas, go ahead and deny him. It's not going to hurt anything. We know better. And he said, oh, he never's denied me. I'll not deny him. Waited to be roasted alive for his faith. And Jesus remembered him in Revelation by name for his faith and for his commitment. So, there's some of the aftermath, some of the things that led up to it, and some of the aftermath that supports Jesus' resurrection. We don't need it. We know by faith, clearly he did. Faith is sight for us. But to be able to see these things, because those people who see these things and still deny him are going to stand before him. And they're going to say, wait a minute, hold on a minute. I was a good person. You're being unfair to me. And he's going to go, you remember? You remember all this I showed you about my death and resurrection? Depart from me. I never knew you. And because they have no defense, there's not going to be any high-powered lawyers there. There's not going to be a judge you can bribe. There's not going to be a judge who has any doubt about the facts. He knows that all. And he will judge. And he will judge us for our works after salvation in the flesh at the Bema seat. Becky says that she hopes that she don't get in line behind me at the Bema seat judgment, by the way, which I think is rather harsh, but kind of humorous. She says she don't want to wait that long for me to answer. Any question or comment on that as we close? Thank y'all for coming. Enjoyed it. We'll not meet next week. We'll try to meet the week after, and we'll decide then how much further we'll go along. I still have some pretty fascinating information to share if you're interested. Nothing? Danny Knight dismisses.